Welcome to Childhelp's Dare to Care podcast, where every story of struggle transforms into a beacon of hope. Together, we'll uncover the courage to rise above our challenges and rediscover joy and resilience. Let's dare to care.
Due to the sensitive nature of the content, viewer and listener discretion is advised.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Pena, and this is the Childhelp Dare to Care Survivor Series. We are broadcasting today from the Center for Positive Media. I'm here with my co-host, Michael Medora, the Chief of Staff from Childhelp. Michael,
Hi.
So great to be back in the studio.
Love it.
And this is a topic that I'm so glad we're bringing this topic to light. We're going to be talking about emotional and verbal abuse,
Yes.
which is not often enough identified when we talk about abuse. But these can have long-lasting, traumatic effects on people.
Very long, very deep psychological effects, especially in today's environment where we are seeing such a rise in mental health concerns and how that is carrying over from adolescence to adulthood. A lot of that stems from the type of verbal and psychological abuse that we're going to get into a little bit this morning.
And our guest is Brian Garding. Brian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Carrie.
We appreciate you sitting in with us. And this is your first time in a television studio and on a podcast, sharing your life story. And it takes bravery to do that. So I just want to first and foremost say thank you for agreeing to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The mission here is really sharing these stories of various forms of abuse. And Childhelp wants to shine the light on survivor stories like yours, because you went through some tough times, but figured out a way to make your life beautiful today. So
Very
with
much
that,
so.
I want to start by talking about when you were 4 years old, you were abandoned by your father.
Well, more accurately, that's when my parents divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, my dad had an affair. The family broke up. I have a younger brother, 2 years old. And so it was traumatic for all of us involved. My dad was moving on to a new family, essentially was what it felt like. Because his new wife, he married pretty rapidly, had two boys as well. So I became stepbrothers pretty early in life.
Mm-hmm. So there was a lot to get used to there at a young age, and it can be confusing. Talk about how things in your home started to develop and this emotional and verbal abuse. How did this take shape?
The emotional and verbal abuse kind of came later when my mom remarried and had a stepdad. I had a stepfather named Tommy. Is it okay to say that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so that type of abuse started later in my life, but the effects of my dad leaving, and I did definitely feel abandoned at that point. He abandoned the family. I don't know how to categorize that sometimes. Mm-hmm. He abandoned the family through a couple different means. I still had like the every other weekend or whatever with him, or one weekend a month. But generally when he picked us up, my brother and I, we would go to his home and spend it with our stepbrothers. Mm-hmm. He was busy working. He was physically present, but not any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And were there substance abuse issues going on in the home?
Absolutely. Yeah, my dad was a heavy drinker by this point. Unbeknownst to me, he was also using cocaine, and his life was moving in definitely the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. When did you start to feel this impacting you as a child? All of this, sort of chaos that was going on.
Right away. My mom had a couple miscarriages prior to my birth. And so she was very protective of me, and my father gravitated towards my brother because he was just the easier kid, mm-hmm. as he described it.
Mm-hmm. So you're trying to find your place in the family structure.
Right away, I was hungry for my father's attention and affection, and I wasn't getting it.
Mm. And when you talk about identifying the emotional and verbal abuse, what did that look like?
So the emotional and verbal abuse, so just being abandoned itself, is very traumatic as far as developing a sense of self, a sense of importance in my family. And I feel like that's where the psychological and emotional abuse or neglect. Neglect is a form of abuse. I put that in the same category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's the largest form of abuse.
Yeah.
It started then. Now, the verbal abuse, my dad wasn't verbally abusive towards me and my brother that I can remember. But my stepfather later on was.
What did that look like?
Stepfather?
Yeah, I mean, the abuse that was taking place. I think it's important to sort of describe so the audience can understand, because sometimes, oh, well, this person was yelling or, diminishing the character of a child, making you feel unsafe. What did it look like to you?
Okay, so with my stepfather, he was one to cast fear into us. Like if we made a mistake or did something wrong, there was always the threat of he had a board that holes were drilled into that he would use for spankings. It wasn't just a belt, or it wasn't just a wooden spoon. He terrified us with it. And the verbal abuse came in the sense of if we made choices or did something that wasn't acceptable in his eyes, he would mock us. He would belittle us. He would, put us down in front of other people, those types of abuse. And that's the psychological part now. Like I'm being shamed for everything I think is right, but I can't express it safely any longer because the damage is now being done, right? The disparaging language has now arrived and I'm being torn apart and lectured and
what did that do to you as a child? And we'll talk about how this manifested in very traumatic ways for you and how you managed to stop that and kind of turn your life the way you wanted it to go.
Well, I started doing things that any teenager would do, right? I started smoking and I tried not to come home after school because I didn't want to be around my stepfather. He also was an alcoholic who was, using cocaine and marijuana in the house. And so he was a drummer in a band. So he worked at nights. So while my mom was at work, he would be at home when I got home from school. And I didn't want to come home. I was afraid just to come home at that point, in age 15, 16.
So this went on for some time.
It did. Yeah.
And then what happened? I mean, how did you start to heal?
Well, all right. So one of a big occurrence was that my stepfather didn't like us using his stereo equipment. So he would leave to go to work or leave to go see his family member or whatever. And so I'd, start messing with his stereo. And he had it set up where the volume was at a certain spot and this speaker was unplugged and I'd figure it out. So I'd figure out how to use his stereo so I could listen to my music on a nice set of speakers. Right. Well, one time he says, I'm going to my grandmother's. This was a holiday. And on purpose, because he suspected us or me, using his equipment. So he turned around in about 10 minutes and came back. And by then I was already caught red-handed and the speaker wire was unplugged. And I was trying to get my disc back out of the CD player. And so as a consequence of that, my mom was not home. And so it was like the longest lecture of my life that I can remember. It was awful, awful day. And then for revenge, he stole one of my cassettes out of my room, just like he was my age, right? Like, I'm going to get revenge on you. So this catapulted into a situation where I started looking through my parents' stuff to find that cassette. I was now trying to figure out why this was missing because it was taken from me in secrecy. And so you see the pattern here, starting secrets, create more secrets, and uncertainty creates more trespassing. I feel like it's a good word for this, is trespassing. And so I discovered the tape in his stuff in his room, went and told my mom. She was at work, and that catapulted that relationship to its end. It was the beginning of the end. My mom couldn't stand what he was doing to us. And so I was now the less liked kid, right? Because I'm reporting my stepfather's stuff that he's doing to me. And so the long lasting impact of that is I felt as if my father didn't love me. And then And then I had to search for his love. And now I have a stepfather who's betraying and verbally abusing us, that I have to stand up to somehow, because I now am 17, rebellious, angry, I'm going to go down the wrong path quickly if I don't change. And I knew that. And so I was put into this role I put myself in the role of trying to fix it, trying to get rid of him. I didn't want him in my life anymore. So just very angry. And I was always seen as the good kid, as the straight A student until 11th and 12th grade. And when this really came to light, and I struggled in school after that. And, and the impact was just, I got into a band playing bass guitar, started drinking a lot, and I was definitely headed the wrong way myself. And so the effects of that abuse caught up with me.
I want to just draw on a point, Michael, that what you're saying, though, I think is courageous, that he stood up. He said something like, this is not okay, and created some boundaries. And that's one of the things at Childhelp that you're really trying to encourage and empower kids to speak up.
Yeah, Brian, actually having a little bit of a conversation before we started this segment about a little bit of the misnomer around verbal and emotional abuse. It's sometimes not seen as significant or as sensitive as sexual abuse or physical abuse, but the reality is it has very significant impacts and trauma that's lifelong on an individual. And he just got done mentioning, that when it started coming to a head, he started struggling in school. And we see that a lot because there's the inability and the lack of confidence in fostering healthy relationships. What is a healthy relationship? Yes. And when I'm starting to doubt the nature and the health of a relationship, when I go into an academic setting or to a classroom, am I going to be valued in the same way as my other peers? Are teachers going to look at me the same way? Or am I a troubled student? And when you're at home and you're going through verbal and emotional and psychological abuse, you carry a lot of that trauma into other relationships and into classrooms. And now all of a sudden, you're reacting and triggered in a classroom environment based upon the trauma that you're experiencing at home and the doubt and the fear that you're experiencing at home, which is challenging your ability to perform to the same level of your peers inside a classroom. And now you're behaving in an outburst way, and you're performing poorly academically. And what we have seen a lot especially inside of schools and institutions, is teachers then, you're the troubled student. You're the difficult student for me. And I don't have enough time to spend with you. I want to go and spend more time with the easier students, which just continues to perpetuate the thinking that this individual is having, that I'm not worthy. I am a bad kid. Nobody my father abandoned me. My new stepfather doesn't like me and he's verbally abusing me and nobody believes me. And now I'm not performing well at school. I am just a difficult person. And the mental health challenges that come with that and the way that you carry that forward into adulthood is long lasting. Correct?
It is. Absolutely. I've been going to 12-step meetings for 25 years and it is my saving grace. Really. So when I was 20, I made the decision to move to Arizona to get to know my dad because he became sober. I was about 17 when he sent, an amends letter. As part of the 12 steps is you make amends. So he sent an amends letter to my mom. And this is really, when he asked me at the beginning of my recovery, this is probably the beginning of my recovery because my dad now has stepped up to apologize and to try to fix things. And no, I didn't know what that meant at the time. And my mom's interpretation of it was very different than his intent, and which makes sense. She's hurt. So at age 20, I decided to move to Arizona to get to know him. So that's how I arrived here. At the same time, I signed up and was going to drafting school at the time. So I lived with my dad for a while. So this is where some interesting dynamics come up. I was still 4 years old up here wanting my dad's love. Yeah, I hadn't grown that way and I didn't know how to. I was stuck and maybe I was older than 4 on some pieces of it, but I still felt like that starving kid. And my dad saw this in me and he didn't know how to be the dad and fix it. So he had heard he went to AA. I don't know how long he'd been at that point. Maybe I'm going to guess 7 or 8 years sober. he had heard of Adult Children of Alcoholics, and he introduced me to that. And I started going to those, the acronym is ACA meetings. And in those meetings is where I started to figure out the neediness and the codependency and all the other pieces that I was exhibiting. And I really started to wrap my head around it. And then a big event. So the first year of my recovery, I called my dad to get together for Thanksgiving. He said no. I went through this abandonment again. It was just triggered all of it all over again, right? And he didn't know. And my ACA group had the Thanksgiving dinner. And so I accepted that. And this is part of the healing, is that when my dad called, I now was strong enough to say, I have other plans now, even though I was hungry for my dad's affection and love. And that was a huge moment in my life. And the hurt that I felt in being dismissed for Thanksgiving or not invited or whatever, not included in his plans, triggered me to, or not triggered, what's the right word? It compelled me to start looking at the hurt. And by Christmas, I did a lot of journaling. I did a lot of personal soul searching. I was very angry for a part of it. And then I got to the point where I could forgive him. And that took, from the time I moved here till that Christmas was probably another 6 or 8 years before I could forgive him. Even though all this had gone on, I was still the hurting person. And like you said, it has long lasting consequences.
What did that forgiveness feel like for you? Was it freeing?
Very. It was the best thing I ever did. That's the best day I ever had with my dad. Mm. He lived out in the country and we had a big fire in the backyard or in the yard. And he's telling like AA jokes and he's, we talked about recovery. And I said, Dad, I know that you are the cause of much of my pain. You know that too. We've talked about it. And I said that, I've been harboring a lot of hurt and anger about it. And I'm at that point where I want to forgive you. And he teared up and said, that's the best Christmas gift I've ever received. So it still gets me today.
It should.
And, that's like 23 years ago now. But it was a very, very pivotal moment in my life where I could start healing. The program he introduced me to saved our relationship and I feel like my life because I was drinking to get comfortable with social awkwardness. I didn't know how to communicate and all of that. I was very angry. Yeah. I was angry for a long time, not knowing that I was hurting myself by being angry. It was an internal hate. Well, so anyway, that's a lot to say.
This podcast is it's important. Everything you're saying is really important. And that's what this show is all about. It's about a journey to healing. We share different stories of abuse and talk about the layers of trauma. But the important part of telling these stories is talking about how do we heal?
Yes.
And how do we find community and safety to heal?
That's it right there, Carrie. You're not alone. There's a community of love and support that wants to know you, that wants you to be a part of them, that wants to share in this journey we call life with you and together. And for an individual like yourself that felt abandonment and loss in such a significant way at such a young age, it's hard for a 4-year-old child to understand how to wrap their head around the idea that somebody that's supposed to love me and care for me and protect me wants nothing to do with me, can function without me. And then to find somebody else take their place that doesn't see any value in me and is hurting me and doesn't care about me. That is all what develops into how we start to formulate our own self-worth and our own value. And you need a community of people around you to sit there and say, you're awesome. I love you. I see you. I care about you. You are important. And unfortunately, for so many children like yourself, they don't get that same pathway forward with two loving parents by their side. That's why you'll learn a lot about what we call adverse childhood experiences. And what you shared today is a number of adverse childhood experiences that you experienced that formulated the journey of life that you've been on. Mm-hmm. But I would honor that moment with your father where you were able to say, here I am, here's how I felt and I forgive you and I'm going to let that go. And your father's response to that, I mean, it's getting me a little bit feels in my feels as well, because I can imagine what that moment must have been like for both of you. And that's what this podcast series is all about, Gary, is for people to understand you're not on that journey alone. And for those that are out there right now that are experiencing a sense of abandonment, are experiencing a sense of loneliness, don't feel valued and worthwhile, you're not alone. We want to connect with you. We want you to know that you're not alone. We want you to know there's a community of love around you. That's what our hotline is all about. That's what our programs and services are all about, is to make sure you know that there is help there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
And I think too, you're using your voice, and to me, it shares an important part of the story. That is, it's never too late to heal, right? Like you didn't just let it go. You were like, Dad, I'm gonna say this. And not knowing how he was going to receive it. Thank goodness for you. It seems like he had done his own healing work. Thank goodness for me. I feel like that's the miracle in this. He was the one that caused so much harm, but yet he got sober at some point and started changing his life so that he could be a better man and be a better person in society. And one final note here, Brian, before we sign off, I think it is also really important to share that you have two sons of your own. And a lot of your healing work is because you were conscientious about breaking the generational cycle of trauma. You did not want to pass some of those same behaviors on in your role as a father. That's correct. I would say too, and I don't know, hopefully this is helpful. I feel like many people have what I do call covert abuse. And it's more silent, and you're not supposed to speak about it. It's maybe not physical or sexual in nature, but the emotional and psychological component is just as big and damaging. And so I hope that people don't minimize the effects of that in their own life, because it's hard to walk out in society and say, yeah, I was abused. And they're like, oh yeah, you weren't nobody, common identification of what abuse is, right? Is what people think of. You weren't in a war. What's wrong with you? That's the stigma I existed in, is like, what's the matter with you? Nothing that bad happened to you. Well, it did. It did. It just didn't look, it wasn't outwardly expressed so much. It was, right. But that was powerful what you just said there, Brian. Yeah. It did. It did happen. Right? It did happen to you. It wasn't an experience. You just can't see it on right. Me. Exactly. Brian, thank you so much. And what would you want people to take away from your story? If you had one thing to say, hey guys, I want you to remember this, what would it be? I think that if somebody wants to or needs to heal, you have to get really honest about what the harm is and who did it, and be able to start addressing that in whether it's counseling, or for me, it was 12-step meetings first with lots of counseling after. Maybe it is a psychiatric appointment where you get medication that helps you in the interim, but seek out help. Don't be afraid to ask somebody, is this normal? What am I feeling? Something that nobody else has ever felt before? Or is there somebody else that has been through this that can help me? Because I felt isolated. Like nobody feels like I did. Yeah. That's not true. I would say that the sooner you intervene in your own life to get well, the less damage you'll do to your future, like partners, children. You'll impact your future generations. And I also feel like I've impacted like my father's siblings in a positive way, and my cousins in a positive way by doing what I do. And others have become sober, etc. So it does make a big impact if you can find the courage to start. That's where it starts. That's where it starts. And you've managed to steer your life on a pretty great path. I met your son outside. Awesome young man. Yeah, he's cool. So you're doing something really right. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate you coming in, sharing your story. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening the Childhelp Dare to Care Survivor Series podcast. You can join us on YouTube to watch the shows, and you can always listen, of course, on Spotify. I'm Carrie Pena alongside Michael Maduro here in our studios. Thanks for being with us, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on Childhelp's Dare to Care podcast. If you found some inspiration from this conversation, please leave a written review on Apple or Spotify. Subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Keep the conversation going with us on our YouTube channel in the comments.